Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion Cloud Migration and Optimization for Government, sponsored by Thundercat Technology and Dell Technologies on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today, Mitchell Schwartz, a systems engineer at Thundercat Technology, Ed Krajcik, the manager of Isilon Systems Engineers at Dell Technologies, Oki Mek, the senior advisor to the chief information officer at the Department of Health and Human Services, and Chris Brown, the deputy chief information security officer at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Before break, Oki, you brought up this idea of data and data management, and do you understand where the data is? And I think when we talk about moving applications and services to the cloud, the data piece becomes so important. So maybe let me bring in Ed on this first question here. When you talk about data management and the cloud, how do the two fit together, and what are things agencies should maybe keep in mind?
Well, from a management perspective, you need to, while the data is still in the cloud, you need to be able to have access to it and be able to access that data without incurring the egress costs associated with pulling the data back. You know, we have technologies in Dell, Isilon specifically, Cloud Pool technology that migrates data from the Isilon file system itself to the cloud, and it maintains the index and the stub for the file or the object on the Isilon system before it goes to the cloud, and that makes it indexable, searchable, be able to do processing and analytics on it without actually having to recall that data from the cloud, thus saving those egress costs. But in general, you need to have a holistic view of your data in the cloud while it's still secure. And we do have tools available that allow you to take a heterogeneous view across your entire file and object systems to be able to look at, different heterogeneous file systems, maybe not even Dell-specific platforms, but being able to see what data is where, whether it's on a file system or in the cloud, and be able to manage and move data around in that way.
Let me just put a finer point on what you said. If I have my data in a cloud, and obviously your technology or whomever's technology I'm using, what I could do with it is almost do all the processing, manipulation, changes on that cloud versus bringing it back to me and then putting it back out to the cloud.
Right. I mean, we're working with metadata locally. We have the ability to access the data in the cloud without actually, like I say, without rehydrating it back to the local file system. Right?
Good terminology, rehydrated.
Yes.
One of the things when we talk about data management is also the read and write privileges, and there's a whole access piece, and we go down the path of identity management and access controls as well. But let me maybe bring Chris on this, since you're the security officer, you get the harder questions on that sense, is when you look at data management, how do you balance the accessibility versus security side?
So I think it's the same as on-prem.
Yeah.
Right, so you role-based access control, you set that up in your cloud, you do the same on-prem. Need to know trumps it, right? You make sure that the controls are there both on-prem or in the cloud to make sure that data is secured, and then use your role-based access to determine who should have access to it.
It sounds so simple again,
it
right?
Does.
Right. But walk me through maybe a little bit of the cloud makes the role-based access setup easier, or it all depends on what software you bring in and applications? It's not necessarily...
So no, I don't think it makes it easier. I think that you simply have to set that infrastructure up in the cloud in order to provide it, right? And then you make the same decisions that you would make on-prem. It's just that when they're doing the work on that data, they're not doing it on-prem, they're doing it in the cloud.
Go ahead, Mitchell.
You can set up PKI infrastructure, you can integrate with the PIV cards.
Oh, absolutely,
so
yes.
It's not like in the past where you were worried, well, how am I authenticating this user and verifying who they are? And now it's not as big of a problem as when cloud first started to have that PIV card enabled into the cloud.
Absolutely.
Mitchell, does the hybrid setup that most agencies are in, does that also impact that side of the data management? The fact is you're going to have some data on-premise, some data in the cloud, and they have to go back and forth?
Absolutely, because you want to know what's being accessed. And typically when we would do this on-prem, we wouldn't put a lot of firewalls, we wouldn't put a lot of restrictions on systems that were next to each other or very close to each other. And now we need to start doing that, but also understanding what commands are being accessed and run. So if I have a web server in the cloud, I have a database server on-prem, what queries is it running? Is it not from a security standpoint, but also is it an unoptimized query, and now drawing a lot of data, pulling a high egress rate back to the cloud provider. So we want to be conscious of these things that we typically had let go free previously.
Please, okay.
In terms of security and data, there's a need to share data nowadays. I think machine learning is critical in terms of clustering and classify the data and put it in the right places. When you want to ask for data, for our cases, electronic health records, people are going to say, oh, you can't do it because of HIPAA or PHI. But if you look at the data and you start classifying and labeling the data and say this falls under HIPAA, this falls under PHI or PII, then you could come to the table and negotiate and say, okay, this doesn't apply to HIPAA. We need the data that doesn't apply to HIPAA or PHI. Or in some cases, you could actually update the policy. And who's better in position to do that? Health and Human Services is to influence policy updates in terms of electronic health records. And that's why I think data and security, there's going to be real need to share data in this era.
Can I ask a question about that? I mean, when we're talking about like PITI type data, I mean, do you feel that the value and the security of that is critical? Would you prefer to have that on-prem, or are you open to putting that type of information in the cloud?
I mean, security in the cloud could be good as well. I mean, if you look in your contracts saying, who's going to do what. I think the issue with security with going to cloud or on-prem is that we end up dealing with the vendor and saying who's doing what and who is responsible for the security, and then we go back and forth because it's not really clearly defined in the contracts. But I think going to cloud, using electronic health records in the cloud, I think it's fine. But you have to understand what you are putting in the cloud, and you have to label it correctly and cluster and classify it correctly. And that's the fundamental of security anyway, is to understand the data before you could categorize the system as a low, moderate, or high.
Yeah. And Chris talked about FedRAMP earlier. I mean, do you feel that the FedRAMP specifications create enough security to put that type of data in the cloud, or are you doing your own assessments and your own additional security controls on top of that?
So I think FedRAMP is awesome because they are giving ATOs to systems, and so agencies aren't having to do that on their own. Though there are some larger agencies that are stepping up and they're doing the ATOs for systems. So it's both the JAB, the Joint Authorization Board, as well as an agency that are ATOing these systems. And so we can take advantage of that. But we do the same thing that we do on-prem, we do for the cloud. And if somebody wants to go to a cloud service, we say, okay, we request the package, we go through and we review all of the security controls and how they have characterized them. And then we determine whether that characterization meets with our expectations. And I'll give you an example. We had one package that said that training was all taken care of, and we said, maybe for them, when they stood it up, training was taken care of, but we have to do our own training. So we did not inherit that, right? We said we are responsible for it. So we do that line for line, control by control review before we present a risk assessment to the CIO to adopt or not to adopt.
When it comes to both security and when you talk FedRAMP, there's the 80-20 rule, if you will. Okay, I'll trust you 80%, but that last 20, the last mile, I'm going to have to do on my own. What happens, I think, too often is when agencies are 50-50 or 30-70, I'll trust you 30%, and then we start getting into this repetition and redundancy of relooking at controls. And I think that's where it gets frustrating. I did want to tag back around to something that Chris also said around when you talk about data and ensuring that it's in the cloud and how you can manipulate it in the cloud. You offered an interesting anecdote about the adjustment it takes internally as well when you put stuff in the cloud. Maybe just talk a little bit about that anecdote.
So we have an office that does high performance computing. So they need some high powered computers in order to crunch the code to give them the results that they need. And they had been used to having these boxes on-prem, so they could touch them. And this was a cultural shift where we moved them into the cloud, and then they wanted to bring the data back. And we've already talked about high egress costs, and that can be rather pricey to pull it all back down. And so it was a cultural shift for them to be able to run the code, get the results in the cloud, leave the result, the actual data there, and then just pull back the results, the report from that. And that has been a successful shift for them. And the real win is that they were having to maintain the systems that were on-prem themselves. They're in the cloud. They're being maintained per the provider's specifications or to our specifications that the provider is giving us. And they're able to spin up virtual machines very quickly, very high power machines, and they can do that without having to go through an acquisition process to bring that on-prem. So they're really appreciative of that aspect of it.
And Mitchell, you were talking about as well that this is a great example of platform as a service, the ability to say, hey, we have this need, let's do it. And then if that need reduces, okay, let's bring it back down. I mean, that's really one of the big benefits of cloud, and especially when it comes to data. I'm sure the researchers have moments where they have a ton of data and then they've used the data and now they're waiting for that next batch to come in. Mitchell, talk a little bit about the benefits.
So one of the other benefits is the hardware will constantly be refreshed. So what we see typically with on-prem equipment is we procure it, we wait 3 to 5 years, and then now we have to do a huge procurement again to try and refresh that gear. Depending on budget, sometimes that can even take even longer. So with the cloud provider, they can update their hardware more frequently because it's not tied to typical government procurement, and now we're able to take advantage of better processors, better systems downstream. So that's a big help to especially people in the HPC community where there's advancements in computing all the time that they're able to use and take advantage of.
And I think that's one of the things when you talk about cloud that we always, initially a big change, and Ed, maybe you could help a little bit about this, is because when we talked about cloud initially, it was cost savings, cost savings, cost savings. And now the benefits are, like as Mitchell described, hey, you could turn it up to satisfy a need, turn it back down. It's more about the mission side, which is I think, a big change we've seen from the discussion points.
Right, and we talk about, again, agility and being able to move things back and forth within the cloud. You know, containerization is the big trend right now, and being able to package up your application. You can run it locally. You can run it in the cloud. You can also run it locally and have the cloud as a DR strategy that makes it a more usable platform in just, being able to, am I running in the cloud? Am I running, locally on-prem? So from that perspective, it changes the paradigm. Again, when you're talking about running compute and things in the cloud, like Mitchell states, you're running on hopefully like state-of-the-art, latest and greatest things. The other thing is that you're only paying for the compute cost and the time that you're running compute. You're not paying for the data transfer time. You're not paying for the data residency or anything like that. When you're talking about compute in the cloud, you're just focusing on the costs of the compute, and you don't have to worry about all the infrastructure and the data transfer costs and things like that.
Okay.
Can I add to that? In terms of cost cutting, I use analogies because it makes sense. It's like buying, either you rent or you buy a home. Are you expecting new child in the family? Are you bringing your in-laws coming into the house? Are you moving in the next couple of years? I think that all has to come into play in terms of decision of moving to the cloud or on-prem, and how much is going to save you money. There's no one-size-fits-all in the strategy. That's why I think a good analogy is, are you renting or are you buying a home?
So Oki touched on this earlier. I talked about governance. And that governance piece, so the scenario that I talked about was key because that's brand new. We used to just have the infrastructure and they could go and they could acquire, the box that they needed to run the code. Now they're having to monitor that, fire it up, and then be able to shut it down in order to keep costs down. If they keep it running, they've run through their budget in a matter of months. So that was something that we needed the business partners to embrace. Right? Because it's their budget that's actually supporting that. And so that's been a pretty big learning curve. We've got some policies in place. I'm sure they'll continue to evolve, but that was a big deal for us.
This is just part of what I was talking about earlier, is making sure your code is correct. Right? We were able to get away with a lot when everything was on-prem and everything was kind of free almost once it hit the processor and once it hit the network. Now that it's not, we have to rethink a lot of our code. We have to rethink a lot of what developers were doing because we don't have that free nature that we see on an on-prem system.
Okay, you brought up earlier in our conversation that you guys are developing kind of a cloud strategy. At the same time, we also have the rise of the chief data officer, the CDO. HHS maybe is a little different. I know your CIO happens to also wear that other hat as CDO, so his conversations are probably pretty easy among himself. But how are you balancing the data needs with the cloud strategy? How are you ensuring those things are coming together?
I think it's a collaborative effort. I think we all have to work together in terms of, because doing things in silos has caused a lot of issues.
Really?
I think
Tell me more.
cloud strategy, you have to go across finance, HR, acquisitions, security, business owner, system owner, operation folks. We all have to come into a committee and discuss and share, because just doing it in silos is not going to work. By the time you make that decision, you're going to fail. I think having that collaborative effort and just communicate, I think, is the key.
But is the data piece being considered as you write the cloud strategy? Meaning, it's not just, okay, let's move to the cloud, like, let's do an assessment and these systems can go and these systems stay, but it's, okay, what data, how much of that conversation is now more focused on data than the systems itself?
Jose is currently the CIO and acting CDO as well.
So I said he wears the same hat, yeah.
But in terms of data and system, I mean, you will not have a system if you don't have a business that needs that IT, and you won't have a system if there's no data. I think the data is the raw information that, like I said, you could map, you could look at it and say, hey, we don't need this system. We could consolidate this. We could do this and we could do that. But the data drives the decision, and the business as well, because you have to look at the organization's missions and visions and values. What are we focusing on? It's really a business strategy more than an IT strategy.
So business is driving, very good. All right, let's take a quick break and come back. We can jump into the last segment. You're listening to the discussion, Cloud Migration and Optimization for Government, sponsored by Thundercat Technology and Dell Technologies on Federal News Network.